Mayer Amschel Rothschild officially founded his banking house in Frankfurt in 1776. That is the date most history books give you, and most people accept it without blinking. But the real machinery of Rothschild power was already humming 20 years before that, built not in a boardroom, but in a cramped alley called the Judengasse, the Jews' Lane, where a young coin dealer was working out something that would quietly reshape European finance for the next 200 years. And here is the question that nobody quite settles. Was the secret a method, a network, a philosophy, or something stranger? Because whatever it was, it has outlasted empires, survived 2 world wars, weathered revolutions, and is still running today. I want to take you through the whole story, not the conspiracy poster version, not the dry Wikipedia summary, but the actual human story of how one family, starting from almost nothing, built a financial dynasty that governments literally could not afford to ignore. We are going to follow the trail from a ghetto in 18th century Frankfurt all the way to the corridors of Whitehall and the floors of the Paris Bourse. And I promise you, the real story is more interesting than the myths. The Judengasse, which translates simply as Jews' Alley, was a single narrow street in Frankfurt where Jewish families were legally confined. They could not own property outside it. They could not walk freely through the city on Sundays or Christian holidays. They could not enter most professions. What they could do, what they were actually permitted to do, because Christian usury laws made it awkward for Christian merchants, was deal in money and coins. And that is exactly where Mayer Amschel began. He was a coin dealer and a trader in rare currency, and he was exceptionally good at it. Here is something that gets overlooked in most accounts. Mayer Amschel's early genius was not financial in the narrow sense. It was relational. He understood, in a way most merchants of his era did not fully appreciate, that information was more valuable than inventory. He cultivated relationships with German princes, not because he was dazzled by titles, but because nobles and aristocrats moved money in large volumes, and they had short memories for who had given them a fair deal last time. Mayer remembered. He kept meticulous records. He followed up. He was, in the language of a much later era, a relentless networker. And he did this in a street where most of his neighbors had neither the connections nor the capital to think that way. One of his earliest and most important patrons was Wilhelm IX, the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest princes in the German-speaking world. Wilhelm had a particular and rather cold-blooded source of income. He rented out his soldiers to foreign powers, most famously to the British Crown during the American Revolutionary War. This generated enormous sums, and Wilhelm needed someone reliable to manage and invest them. Mayer Amschel became that someone. It was not a clean or comfortable relationship by modern moral standards, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, but it gave the Rothschild house something invaluable, a sustained, high-volume cash flow and the credibility that came with managing a royal fortune. Every other European money house could see who Mayer Amschel was working for. But here is the move that I keep coming back to, the decision that turned a successful Frankfurt trading house into something genuinely unprecedented. Around the turn of the 19th century, Mayer Amschel made a decision that sounds almost obvious in hindsight, but was radical at the time. He sent each of his 5 sons to a different financial capital of Europe. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt, Salomon went to Vienna, Nathan went to Manchester and then London, Karl went to Naples, James went to Paris. 5 cities, 5 sons, 1 family, and crucially, 1 shared intelligence network running between all of them. Think about what that meant in an age when a letter between London and Paris took days, when stock prices in one city had no reliable connection to stock prices in another, when the fastest way to move information across a continent was a man on a horse. The Rothschilds built their own courier network. They had riders, boats, even carrier pigeons by some accounts, though the pigeon story may be slightly embroidered by time. What is not embroidered is the basic fact: the Rothschilds consistently knew things before other banking houses did. Not because they cheated, but because they invested heavily and deliberately in the speed of information. That asymmetry, knowing first, is the engine of almost every fortune this family ever made. Nowhere is that more vivid than in the story of Nathan Rothschild and the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815. This is the episode that gets the most dramatic retelling, and I should be honest with you, some of the details are genuinely disputed by historians. The broad outline, though, is well established. Nathan, operating in London, received word of Napoleon's defeat before official government dispatches arrived in Britain. What he did with that information next has been argued about ever since. The popular legend says he immediately bought British government bonds, consols, at a moment when the market was paralyzed by uncertainty, effectively cornering the market before prices corrected upward. Some accounts suggest he initially sold, creating a brief panic, then quietly bought back at depressed prices. Exactly which version is true is something historians still debate. What is not disputed is the outcome. By the time official news of Wellington's victory reached London and bond prices recovered, Nathan Rothschild had positioned himself, one way or another, to profit enormously. And more than the profit itself, the episode cemented something in the minds of European governments. This family knew things, moved fast, and understood sovereign debt in a way that no one else quite matched. You want to fund a war. You want to stabilize your currency after a catastrophe. You go to the Rothschilds. Not because you like them. Governments of that era rarely went out of their way to like Jewish bankers, but because you need them. This brings me to something I think gets underplayed in the standard Rothschild story, and it has to do with the nature of sovereign debt itself. When a government needs to raise enormous sums for a war, for infrastructure, for a debt crisis, it issues bonds. Bonds are essentially promises. The government promises to repay a sum with interest over time. The question is always whether investors believe that promise enough to buy the bond. What the Rothschilds understood, earlier and more clearly than almost anyone, is that the key to the whole bond market is confidence. Not just the government's financial health, but the mood of the market, the perception of risk, the psychology of large-scale investors across multiple countries simultaneously. And because the Rothschilds operated in 5 capitals at once, they could both read that mood and, to a remarkable degree, shape it. If Salomon in Vienna and James in Paris were both seen to be buying a particular sovereign bond, other investors noticed. The Rothschild name was itself a signal. When they went in, others followed. When they hesitated, others hesitated. This is not conspiracy. This is what happens when a single family controls enough of the communication infrastructure and enough of the credible capital that their behavior functions as a market signal. It is the same dynamic you see in modern financial markets when a very large institutional investor makes a move. The market watches and reads it. So far we have talked about the how. The network, the speed, the sovereign debt expertise. But there is another layer to the Rothschild story that I find genuinely fascinating, and it is the internal architecture of the dynasty itself. Mayer Amschel, before he died in 1812, left a set of instructions for his children that amounted to something close to a family constitution. The core principles were: keep the business in the family, keep the family in communication with one another, and, for several generations, keep marriages within the family network wherever possible to prevent the fortune from fragmenting outward. That last point sounds alarming to modern ears, and by the standards of modern genetics and ethics, it absolutely should. First-cousin marriages within the Rothschild family were common throughout much of the 19th century. Historians have noted this plainly. The motivation was financial and dynastic, not romantic, and I am not going to dress it up. The family was deliberately treating itself as a closed system, a holding structure in human form, to prevent the fragmentation of wealth that typically destroys dynastic fortunes within 2 or 3 generations. Whether it was wise or not is a moral question I will leave to you. What is historically clear is that it worked, at least in the narrow financial sense, for longer than most such strategies survive. If you are enjoying this journey through the family that rewired European finance, I would love for you to subscribe and join the community here on the channel. We spend a lot of time on exactly this kind of history, the money, the power, and the human beings behind it all. Now, back to the story. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschilds had moved far beyond government bonds. They financed railways across Europe. The railway boom of the 1830s and 1840s was partially Rothschild money funding infrastructure from Austria to France to Britain. They were involved in the financing of the Suez Canal, which eventually passed into British and French hands and became one of the most strategically important pieces of infrastructure on the planet. They lent to the British government so Disraeli could buy a controlling stake in that canal on famously short notice in 1875. The story goes that Disraeli needed the money immediately, before Parliament could be recalled to authorize it, and that it was a Rothschild who wrote the cheque, roughly £4 million, which was a staggering sum, on the understanding that the government would repay it. That story has been told many times, and the broad shape of it is considered historically sound, even if some of the colour has been added over the years. What strikes me about moments like that is not the scale of the money, but the intimacy of it. The British Prime Minister needing to call on a private banking family to fund a geopolitical maneuver that would define British imperial strategy for decades.